However, the government denied this and said the way they were able to get access to the server was because of vulnerabilities in Silk Road's code, which leaked the server's IP address. This is definitely possible because, as we've already established, Silk Road's code had plenty of problems because of how quickly it had been developed by Ross, who'd initially been working on it all by himself. Either way, now that the FBI had tracked down the Silk Road server in Iceland, they could access a lot of crucial data. Most importantly of all, they could see activity on the server, like whenever the Silk Road admin logged in or out. The logs showed the most recent admin login had come from an internet cafe in San Francisco. Whilst this was a major breakthrough, the FBI still didn't have any leads on who the hell Dread Pirate Roberts actually was. And that's when they got a call from Gary at the IRS. Gary got on a group call with agents from other departments working on the case, like the DEA and FBI, and he laid out everything he'd found. Gary explained that this person with the username Altoid had been the first one to mention Silk Road online, and he'd made multiple posts about Silk Road on different forums, almost like he was promoting the site when it first began. Gary said that the user had slipped up, and on one of his later posts included his personal email, rossulbricht@gmail.com. Gary then went on to explain how on Stack Overflow, a user had posted a coding question related to Tor under the name Ross Ulbricht, but then a minute later changed the name to the pseudonym Frosty. At that exact moment, one of the other agents on the call cut Gary off and said, "Wait, did you just say Frosty?" Gary was a little frustrated. He still had more to explain. "Yes, I said Frosty, but why are you focusing on that part?" Gary asked. The agent replied, "When we got the server from Iceland, we found that both the server and the computer that belongs to DPR had both been given the same name, Frosty." There was a brief silence on the call. The dots were starting to connect. Gary then added that he tracked where Ross was currently living because of the incident with the fake IDs on his record. However, when Gary shared Ross's current address with the FBI, they couldn't believe it. Ross was living in San Francisco, just a couple of blocks from the internet cafe where they tracked the Silk Road admin IP address. This was clearly their guy. The truth was now clear to everyone on the call. The FBI agents, the DEA agents, and Gary from the IRS. Ross Ulbricht was Dread Pirate Roberts. Gary had been right. The elusive criminal mastermind they'd been chasing for the last couple of years perhaps wasn't quite the criminal mastermind they'd thought. He'd made several major mistakes that exposed his true identity. His downfall was simply because of human error. This was a guy in his 20s who'd never expected Silk Road to become what it did, and thus hadn't taken enough care to cover his tracks. Or, as Gary would say, this was the digital equivalent of the parking ticket, a minor detail that had been overlooked. Either way, the authorities finally knew that Ross Ulbricht was the one behind Silk Road. Now, they just had to catch him. But surprisingly, that wasn't going to be as easy as you'd think. The FBI assigned a team of undercover agents to track Ross and watch his every move. Because they had access to the Silk Road server logs now, they could literally see when the Silk Road admin logged in or out, and it always coincided with when Ross opened or closed his laptop. It was undeniable he was their guy, so why weren't they rushing in immediately to arrest him? Well, you see, they needed to catch him with his laptop open. That laptop contained all kinds of valuable data that would not only help in prosecuting Ross, but also in tracking down other people who'd worked on Silk Road or big dealers on the site. But if a team of agents just suddenly swarmed in to arrest Ross, he would likely have time to close his laptop lid, which would lock it, and mean all the data was encrypted and near impossible to break into. Plus, if they didn't catch Ross literally sitting at his laptop, it would give him some kind of deniability, so they had to catch him red-handed with the laptop open in front of him so they could definitely prove he was responsible. When Ross woke up on October 1st, 2013, it seemed just like any other day. He initially went to a nearby cafe, but it was quite busy and he couldn't get a spot to work in that was private enough, so instead he went to sit in the San Francisco Public Library. He found a secluded spot where nobody could see his screen and logged into the Silk Road admin area. Of course, Ross was completely unaware that the library was filled with undercover FBI agents who were watching him. But remember, one wrong move from the authorities and Ross could panic and close the laptop, thus encrypting all the data. They couldn't let Ross know they were onto him or it would all be over. So, two undercover agents created a distraction right behind Ross, posing as a couple arguing. One of them swore loudly in the quiet library, causing Ross to turn around to see what was going on. At that exact moment Ross turned around, another agent who'd been positioned right next to him swooped in and grabbed the laptop off the table in front of Ross. Ross tried to reach out to grab it, but it was too late. Another agent had come up behind him and handcuffed him, placing him under arrest. It was all perfectly timed, so Ross had no chance to react. Ross had been caught logged into the admin section of Silk Road, and in the corner of the computer was the name Frosty. And not just that, on his unlocked computer was a full diary about running Silk Road, along with thousands of chat messages he'd sent whilst running the site, all of which could be used as evidence to convict him and verify this story. Newspapers and TV stations all around the world covered the story. The Boy Scout who'd been secretly running a website that trafficked an estimated $1.2 billion of drugs, weapons, poisons, and other illegal goods. His family was sure he'd been framed or there'd been a mistake. This couldn't possibly be there, Ross, could it? Sometimes when I'm researching these business stories, they feel more like the plot of a Hollywood movie than real life. But they do say that the truth is often stranger than fiction. And this next part is absolutely ridiculous. So, after the authorities got hold of Ross's open laptop, they could see everything, including all his chat histories. But this led the FBI to realize there was a government agent who'd been working on the Silk Road case who had been privately messaging Ross and accepting secret payments from him in exchange for information about the case. This corrupt agent was Carl Force, and he obviously thought because the messages were encrypted and the payment was in Bitcoin, he would never get caught. But now the government had Ross's chat histories and records of the Bitcoin transactions. It had all started when Carl initially posed as a big-time drug smuggler on the Silk Road forums under the username Knob. He began messaging Ross, or as he knew him back then, Dread Pirate Roberts, and started to build a relationship with him. Once Carl had built up some trust with Ross, he told him that he knew of a mole within the DEA and started selling information about the Silk Road case to Ross. Of course, Carl himself was the mole. He was taking payments from Ross in exchange for information about the case. Over the course of several months, Carl received over $750,000 in Bitcoin in exchange for sending information to Ross about the Silk Road case. But things get much crazier. You see, one of the employees Ross had hired to help him with Silk Road was a guy called Curtis Green, who had become a site moderator. But one day when Curtis got a large shipment of coke sent to his house, he was caught by the Baltimore task force and got arrested. Ross was obviously confused why his moderator suddenly stopped replying to him, because at first he had no idea Curtis had been arrested. And then he noticed Curtis had stolen $350,000 from Silk Road, because as a moderator, Curtis had access to some of the site's funds that were being held in escrow. Now, Ross obviously assumed Curtis had betrayed him, that he'd stolen money from the site and then vanished. But in yet another twist, it wasn't Curtis who stole the money from the site. It was another corrupt agent on the Baltimore task force called Sean Bridges. After arresting Curtis Green, Sean had logged into Curtis's Silk Road account that had moderator privileges and started transferring some of the Silk Road Bitcoins to his own personal account. So this government agent was basically siphoning money off Silk Road to his own personal Bitcoin wallet whilst logged in with Curtis's moderator account. And just to be clear, Sean wasn't doing this to turn the money over to the government. He was moving the funds to his own personal private accounts, thinking he wouldn't get caught because it was in Bitcoin. So, just to recap, we now have two different corrupt agents working on the Silk Road case who are both part of the Baltimore task force, both with their own separate schemes to steal Bitcoin for themselves. As for Ross, he obviously had no idea about any of this. He just assumed Curtis had robbed him. So, according to the chat logs from Ross's computer, he decided to hire someone to go after Curtis. Initially, Ross didn't want to kill him. He just wanted his money back and maybe to beat him up a bit. However, Ross's inner circle that he spoke to on Silk Road, like Variety Jones, persuaded Ross it was the right decision to have Curtis killed, because he needed to send a message that he couldn't be crossed. Otherwise, other Silk Road employees might think about betraying Ross in the future as well. Ross had to send a message. Ultimately, Ross agreed and asked if anyone could kill Curtis. One of the people who saw that request was Carl Force, the other corrupt agent who was part of the same team who just arrested Curtis. Sensing an opportunity to make yet more money for himself, Carl replied using his Knob username and said he knew some pros who could get the job done. He said they need $40K up front and $40K after the execution was complete. So Ross sent the first half of the payment. Carl then got Curtis, who he had under arrest, and staged his death. They took a photo of what looked like Curtis's dead body, except Curtis wasn't dead. It was just a staged photo. But Ross didn't know that. He assumed the hit had been carried out successfully and paid the rest of the money to Carl. Ross did write back that he was a little disturbed by the photo and explained, "I'm new to this kind of thing." It was clear he was quite distressed about issuing a hit on someone. But as far as Ross knew, Curtis had stolen hundreds of thousands of dollars from him, so he rationalized that having him killed was necessary. In reality, of course, Curtis was alive, and it was the corrupt agent Sean who'd stolen the money from Curtis's moderator account. And the other corrupt agent Carl, who'd faked Curtis's death in order to make even more money from a supposed hit job. Shortly after this, Ross would end up ordering hits on 5 other people who crossed him, including a hacker who was trying to extort money from him. As far as Ross was concerned, he now had the power to pay to get anyone killed if he needed to. In the diary on Ross's computer, he wrote, "Sent payment to Angels for hit on Tony 76 and his 3 associates," which was then followed by an update about some work he'd done on the site that day. It seemed like ordering a hit on someone had now just become a fairly normal part of the job to Ross. But again, just like with the hit he ordered on Curtis, none of these murders Ross paid for ever took place. No bodies were ever found. It seems Ross was simply getting scammed by other people claiming to be hitmen, and nobody had actually been killed. Which was lucky for Ross, because when he eventually got caught in the library and all these messages he'd sent were discovered, the murder for hire charges against him were dropped. Because even though they had evidence from his chat logs that he paid for those hits, and that he believed the orders had been carried out, it was all an elaborate scam, and he couldn't be convicted of murder when nobody had been murdered. Now, for legal reasons, I should stress that Ross's family still maintains that someone planted those messages on his computer and that Ross never wrote them himself. As for Carl and Sean, the 2 corrupt agents, both were sentenced to around 6 years in prison each. It's seriously crazy that 2 separate government agents working on the same case both tried to steal so much money and secretly transfer it to their own Bitcoin wallets. And if Ross hadn't been caught, they likely wouldn't have been caught either. But of course, Ross was caught. And now it's time we look at the final and most crucial part of all of this. What actually happened to Ross? Okay, it's time for a very quick break while I ask you a favor. If you're enjoying this video so far, please turn on the notification bell for Magnates Media. I'm posting mini movies about business, money, marketing and more, but just subscribing doesn't always mean you'll see them. So please consider turning on notifications and I'll love you forever. Ross was being charged with 7 different offences, including drug trafficking, money laundering, and the Kingpin statutes, something which was normally reserved for cartel leaders. However, even though Ross had been caught with his fingers on the laptop whilst logged in as the admin on Silk Road, he still pled not guilty. His lawyers admitted that Ross had started the Silk Road, but claimed he had done so as a social experiment, not as a business to make money. They then said shortly after he started the site, things had begun to get a little out of control, and thus Ross had decided to sell the site to someone else, who went by the name Dread Pirate Roberts. They claimed that after that, Ross had no further involvement in the site, and that Ross was simply being set up as the fall guy by the real DPR. They argued the chat logs and diary on Ross's computer had been planted there to try and pin all the blame on him. However, unfortunately for Ross, the evidence against him was overwhelming. He had literally been caught logged into the Silk Road admin page, loaded on his laptop, whilst at the library.